Hello, this is a recording of a talk given at Leaping Hare in 2022. And I'll aim to keep this at roughly the same length and cover as much of the same territory as the Leaping Hare talk did. So this is an overview of the rather entertaining royal myth of ancient Egypt. The story told chiefly of the deity whom the Greeks referred to as Osiris. The Greek recordings we have of various stories, particularly this one, Plutarch, one of the Greek writers from the 2nd century, AD, CE, whatever you want to call it. He gives the fullest, most fleshed out version of the story. There are sections of the story and references to it in poetry and spells and various other writings, going all the way back to the 24th century BCE, which was found in the pyramid texts, writings inside the walls of the pyramids, the war stelae and so on. We don't have a full version of the Egyptian understanding of the story, just writings. It's Plutarch who gives us the fullest version, and there is some question raised by historians, Egyptologists, etc., as to whether Plutarch's version is absolutely bang on down the line the version that the Egyptians understood, or whether he has a somewhat embroidered version bringing in elements that would have been unknown to the Egyptians. Without the benefit of a TARDIS to nip back in time, we can't know for absolute certain which way it would have gone in terms of which elements are definitely Egyptian and which might be later Greek introductions to the story. But the Greek version of the story, along with the names used by the Greeks to describe the Egyptian deities, the Negeru, the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt, are not the same as the names that the Egyptians themselves understood or used in reference to their deities or to other things like the very name of their own country. The word Egypt comes from a Greek word. So one of the words that the Egyptians themselves used was Kemet, which means the black land. And modern day historians and theologians and so on have slightly differing understandings of why Kemet is called Kemet. For example, there is a movement chiefly based in America, which is a religious movement, a spiritual movement entirely for black people. They don't allow in white people or Asian people or Chinese people or whatever, it's only for black people, and they regard the Egyptian religion as their traditional spiritual heritage. One of the arguments advanced there is that the Black Land is called the Black Land because it was once upon a time populated entirely by black people, and only later do they argue do the other ethnicities, people of Arabic descent, etc., come into Egypt. An understanding that's more widespread in academic circles is that Kemet is called that because Egypt, back before the building of the Aswan Dam, enjoyed 3 main seasons. There was a season of an intense heat in which pretty much everything was sweltering and dying of heat stroke, and plants shrivelling up and pools drying away to nothing and so on. You could compare it to the idea of winter in Europe. So winter is obviously, for us Europeans, the dead season, or that intensely hot period. For the Egyptian is their dead season, in which it was just the weather was so unpleasant it was too hot to do anything. At the end of the incredibly hot season, the waters, or the snows really, up in the mountains of Ethiopia began to melt, and the waters came down the rivers of Ethiopia that fed into the various tributaries that fed into the River Nile itself. And that huge kind of tidal wave of water would flood down into Egypt and burst the banks of the Nile and spread out like a lake on either bank of the Nile. And would remain there for a good couple of months, this sort of great lake of water, so much so that people would no longer be able to walk from their home to the shops, to the marketplace, to wherever they were going. They would have to get in little flat-bottomed barges, little boats, and punt across to where they wanted to go, and houses were built on raised banks, ready for the fact that they would be flooded, so that the waters wouldn't actually go into the house themselves. Obviously, these days in Britain, when we build on floodplains, we haven't got the intelligence, apparently, to do that. So lots of poor people find their houses regularly filled with mud and silt and gunge because their local river has burst its banks, and houses are not designed to cope with this likelihood. Even though they're built on the floodplain, the Egyptians had the sense, if you live on the floodplain, build high. So that they did. During that flooding season, the river would carry down all sorts of bits of plant and tree and dead animals, and no doubt a few dead people who'd been washed away on the floodwaters, and all of that decaying plant matter and decaying animal matter would stink the place to high heaven, which is why the season was called the Great Stink, and would, as the waters gradually resided, drop down. They would leave this layer of gunge, of silt, of basically compost, black compost from all the rotting plants and rotting animal corpses. And it's that compost, that gungy, smelly black compost left either side of the riverbanks, that made the land of Egypt so incredibly fertile that it was often referred to as the breadbasket of Africa, because they just grew such abundant crops they could export it here, there and everywhere, and made them incredibly rich and very well fed. And a lot of historians assume that Hamet, the Black Land, is to do with the colour of the black soil left behind after the Great Flood, rather than the skin tones, the ethnicity of the people who lived there. But you believe whichever one you want. If you believe either of them, you might think there's a different explanation entirely. But that's part and parcel of the understanding of the land. And it does, as well as giving an account of the name of the land, give an insight and idea into the huge importance of geography and weather to the ancient Egyptian peoples, and to their spirituality, their understanding of the cosmos in which they lived. They were very much centred in their own landscape, in the sanctity of the great river that provided them with life and trade, and also threat, danger, in the form of hippos and crocodiles and various other animals that were of quite a degree of menace. In fact, I believe, statistically to this very day, more people are killed by hippos in Africa than are killed by lions or any other kind of predatory animal. They're short of the actual mosquito itself spreading endless disease. The hippo remains one of the most dangerous animals in Africa to this very day, in terms of bumping people off. So an image there on the slide of the river going down through Egypt and out into the Nile Delta, that green bit at the top of the map there. The deity of the river is Hapi. Now, I'm going to try and resist the urge to refer to Hapi as he, although that is often the way a lot of books refer to Hapi, because in various descriptions, Hapi has both male and female features. Breasts and often a penis as well is a sort of intersexed, what used to be called hermaphroditic once upon a time. And so quite how one ought to refer to Hapi, I can't say as I've ever had a visionary experience where Hapi has turned up and insisted on a particular set of pronouns, so I've no reason to prefer one set above another, but shall we say they, for the moment, for lack of a better term to address Hapi, flows through the very Nile itself, is the very spirit of the great river, this massive, enormous river, the gargantuan tide of water that floats down, and guardian and protector of all of the creatures that live within the river, and the plants that grow up on the banks of the river, the great reed beds and the papyrus beds that can be found up in the Nile Delta. Now, just to create a bit of a confusion, when we look at the map on the slide in front of us, Lower Egypt is technically at the top of the map, and Upper Egypt is the long, thin part of the river, or it looks thin when you see it on a map, that depicts the Nile. So Upper is below Lower, just to confuse everybody. Those two kingdoms were united many, many thousands of years ago by a monarch whose name is not known for absolute certain. There are some insignia that have been left behind from that era depicting a scorpion And so a number of historians got into the habit of referring to that great leader as the Scorpion King, which also ended up as the title of a rather cheesy Hollywood film featuring Dwayne Johnson. Very entertaining, of course, but historical twaddle, as so much of his Hollywood films have a tendency to be. But prior to the lifetime of the Scorpion King, technically there were actually two Scorpion Kings, but prior to their lifetime, Egypt was divided into a number of tribes which sometimes got on well with each other and sometimes went to war with each other. There are 42 tribal districts, what we might compare to counties in Britain, Suffolk and Essex and Norfolk and so on. So similar to our system of having counties, they had their tribal districts, the Sepat. And these 42 Sepatu, which is the plural term, each had their own governing individual, the Haretepeya, who was a bit like a mayor, I suppose, for lack of a better word, who oversaw the district. They had their own flag, they had their own local dialects and variations of pronunciation, their own favoured deities who were particularly associated with their area. These 42 broadly divided into two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt. And there you've got the even bigger picture going all the way from Ethiopia, where the snows melt, flood down through Sudan, what is now called Sudan, and into Egypt. The name that the Egyptians, ancient Egyptians, gave to Ethiopia was Habeshet, and they had a very low opinion of the people of Habeshet. Generally speaking, there are myths about the conflict between the pharaohs of Egypt and the chieftains, the kings of Habeshet. So this long-standing feud between the two. I don't off the top of my head know what the people of ancient Ethiopia called themselves in terms of how they referred to the name of their own land, but Habeshet was the Egyptian term. So that's where the waters flood down, and you've got the division already mentioned between Upper and Lower Egypt. That split with 22 Sepatu, 22 of these counties, on the long stretch of river, which is Upper Egypt, which, as I said, is actually underneath Lower Egypt when you look at it on this kind of a map. And if you've got really good eyesight, you can see the split between the numbered divisions there. That was referred to as the Red Land, which in Egyptian term is Deshrek, from which we get the modern day English word desert, because the baked sandy soil, can't really call it soil, the baked earth, the baked land, the sands either side are very red due to iron content and a variety of other factors, so it was referred to as the Red Land, and it's associated with one of the deities we'll talk about very shortly. Ironically, again, just to confuse them, the Egyptians have a love of doing things in a slightly, what Europeans might think of as a bit of a back-to-front fashion, because the Red Land was represented by a monarch wearing a white crown, not a red crown, as you might automatically assume, and governed over by the goddess Nekhbet, whose imagery is the vulture. Lower Egypt is the Nile Delta, which comes out eventually into the Mediterranean, and the Nile splits into lots of these subsidiary rivers, and that's where the chief production of papyrus, all the reed beds, were. So that was a massive export there, and the existence of papyrus enabled the Egyptians to create comparatively cheap paper. In Europe, we were using parchment made out of animal skins, which cost an absolute fortune to make. So books were phenomenally expensive, whereas in Egypt, scrolls were comparatively cheap and could be produced in much vaster numbers and used and reused and so forth. So the Egyptians became incredibly literate, or at least the scribe class did. Your average Egyptian probably couldn't read and write any more than the average European, the average Chinese person, the average anyone anywhere in the world in that period of history. Most people couldn't read and write, but they had a highly educated caste of scribes who could read and write. And the development of the written word is often attributed to Seshek, the goddess of the libraries, and I just love the fact that they have a goddess of the libraries. I think everyone should have a goddess of libraries. She developed the art of writing, and her husband, Chakute, who the Greeks referred to as Thoth, the ibis-headed deity. He was the one who taught the art of writing to humanity. So his wife developed it, and he passed it on to humans and became the patron, or one of the patrons, of the scribe caste. So you've got these delta regions there. And the delta region, which is lots of rivers and swamps and mud, has, or had historically, a king wearing a red crown. So the red and the white crown represents the red land, and the red crown represents the watery lands of the Nile Delta. Now, when the two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt, were united under one leader, the pharaoh, effectively the first pharaoh to all practical intents and purposes, wore a double hat. And you can see that in a number of artworks, where a pharaoh is wearing both a red hat and a white hat, a red crown and a white crown at the same time. I dare say they might have had to redesign it a little bit to fit two hats on one head. And often that's with a golden headband with a vulture's head and a serpent head. The vulture to represent Nekhmet, and the cobra head, the serpent head, to represent Vajet, the goddess who takes cobra form. So a complex union of territories. And they unified and made Egypt phenomenally powerful within Africa, and phenomenally powerful as well in the Mediterranean area. They had a huge influence on Greece, and through Greece a huge influence on Rome, and through Rome, of course, on the whole Roman Empire. So eventually, of course, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire. But long before it was made into part of the Roman Empire, it was still having this very, shall we say, indirect influence on the culture, not only of many countries in Africa, but many countries in Europe, and eventually, if you go long-term history, on practically the whole world, indirectly. Now, that brings us to the main tale of focus. So, trying to keep this relatively short, because I've waffled on quite enough as it is. The deity on the left, whom the Greeks refer to as Osiris, can be understood as having a number of different names. Now, we're challenged with the Egyptian written language, in that the Egyptian written language, although it does have vowel sounds, places primary emphasis on consonant sounds in writing. And so you can see a word, and it is in effect missing what we would think of as vowel sounds, because the scribes, the writers, obviously growing up, speaking the language, reading the language, would have known themselves automatically by looking at the word in the context of the wider sentence, precisely how to pronounce it. We have a similar issue in Hebrew, in terms of how that is written. And if you can read Hebrew, if you're Jewish, well, not every Jewish person is fluent in Hebrew, but a majority can read Hebrew at least fairly well, and obviously rabbis will read it extremely well, and some non-Jewish people can read Hebrew too. You see a word, and from the context you know what the vowel sounds ought to be, because the same consonants could spell more than one word, but it's the context that gives you which version of that set of consonants in terms of which vowel sounds go with the consonant sounds, so you know how to pronounce it. So we now have deities who, when we look at Egyptian written sources, we have consonantal sounds for their names, but not necessarily always vowel sounds. And so we have to take a bit of a guess in the modern world as to what those vowel sounds would be. It's not a blind random guess, it's an informed guess. The process is called transliteration, of taking one alphabet and trying to create sounds, pronunciations for it in a different alphabet. So taking the Egyptian alphabet and trying to make it pronounceable to people familiar with the English alphabet, for example, is a process of transliteration. Working out what the vowel sounds are is partly helped in the modern world by the existence of the Coptic Church. Now, the Coptic Church uses a version of ancient Egyptian language as its liturgical language, the language in which prayers and other religious services are spoken and conducted in the Coptic Church. And it's as close as you can get these days to understanding what ancient Egyptian language would have sounded like when it was spoken. So the version of Osiris's name that I personally prefer to use is Azur. Other people who follow Egyptian deities in this day and age, some of them like Azur, and others prefer various other interpretations and pronunciations like Wazir and so on. But we are talking about the same deity, so I'll stick to Azur because that's the one I like the sound of. And his sister, who is also his wife, in the ancient Egyptian language, in poetry and song lyrics and so on, the word for wife is also the word for sister, and the word for husband is also the word for brother. And so sometimes it's quite confusing as to exactly the nature of the relationship between two people in a story or in a poem, a song. Are they brother and sister in the biological sense? Are they husband and wife in the romantic sense? Or are we getting all a bit inbred and a bit of both? Inbreeding was not common amongst the ordinary people of ancient Egypt any more than it is anywhere else in the world. But we do know that some members of the royal families were very, very close in terms of intermarrying. What's not always obvious is whether their intermarriage was purely a formal matter, or whether there was a sexual element as well. Obviously, the women usually went on to have children, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were having sex with the husband, who might have also been in some occasions a brother or an uncle. On one occasion, a woman married her own grandfather. They may have been having sex with the chief vizier or the head of the palace guard or somebody or another. That man might have been the actual biological father of the children, but for purposes of dynasty and inheritance, they went through possibly a formal marriage to one of their own blood kin. Or, then again, maybe I'm being a little naive there, and we might actually just be looking at incest taking place in the royal families. Plenty of examples of that in the royal families of Europe, so possibly in the royal families of Egypt too. But the sister wife is known to the Greeks as Isis. I prefer the pronunciation of Azet. There are other pronunciations out there, but we'll go for Azur and Azet. Now, the version I've already mentioned, Plutarch, one of the Greek writers, the version of the story we'll look at is chiefly his version, and I've already flagged up that there is some question as to how much of his version is straight down the line out of ancient Egyptian story, and how much might have been an add-on from Greek sources. We don't really know, but we'll go with it anyway. So his understanding is that Azur rules as the first pharaoh and spreads joy and light and wisdom and happiness throughout Egypt, and brings agriculture and law and order and education and all sorts of wondrous things to the people of Egypt. And after a while he decides to go and spread the love around other parts of the world, and he travels and carries the wisdoms of Egypt to other places. And his sister wife Azet rules brilliantly in his place. But Azur, and of course Azet, being brother and sister themselves, have another brother, who the Greeks referred to as Seth. I prefer the pronunciation of Setech. There are other pronunciations out there. The Red Lord, the Lord of the Red Deserts. And Setech somewhat seethes at the thought that his brother, this very peaceful, gentle soul who is focused on, say, knowledge and learning and agriculture and arts and sciences, is off doing his own thing elsewhere, enlightening the rest of the world, because Setech is a man of, a god I should say, of ambition, of ruthlessness, of determination. So just as we could get all a bit Jungian from it and see Azur and Setech as two sides of a coin, the coin of kingship. Kingship, leadership, pharaohship, whatever you want to call it, consists of both culture and wisdom and knowledge and peace. What's the point of having a leader who never brings you peace? But it also often consists of expansionism and territorialism and imperialism and warfare, of fighting off rivals and conquering territories, and one is the iron fist, the other is the velvet glove. So we can understand a duality between the two brothers, that they each have qualities necessary to leadership, and any leader who only has half of the qualities we might think of as being a only half a leader, really, that you need both. This story can be seen as a play out between these two traits of how they balance each other out and eventually one day integrate. So Seth has the envy for the throne. He would like to take the throne of Egypt and depose his brother and expand the lands of Egypt and conquer and achieve dominance and so forth. And he waits for a great royal occasion when Azur is back in the court, and people are attending great royal banquets and doing all of the glad-handing and grandiosities that the rich and the powerful and the influential do at such occasions. Seth makes a gift, and in the account given by Plutarch, there are shades of Cinderella going on here, not quite in terms of fitting on the glass slipper, but not far off it, because the gift that Seth makes is this huge great chest, an ornate, beautifully decorated wooden chest, which he says is made for whosoever fits it. And he opens the lid up and they all look inside, and there's a sort of a cavity in which a body can rest, a sort of padded cavity, and a bit like Cinderella and the slipper, whomsoever this slipper fits, etc. Seth effectively says, whomsoever this box fits can have it. And so there's a bit of a slightly jokey scene in Plutarch's telling where the various gods and goddesses get in, and one's too tall, and one's too short, and one's too fat, and one's too thin, and all the rest of it. And of course the box has been designed to the exact dimensions of Azur. He gets in and says, oh, it's very comfy, it's perfect fit, lovely. Whereupon Seth slams the lid down, clicks his fingers, and out come his 72 followers, the Shemsu, the followers of Seth. Now, these 72 people have been attending in the hall and minding their own business up to this point, but they jump up at their leader's command, whip out various weapons, menace everyone, make it abundantly clear that no one dare interfere with what is about to happen, and the lid of the coffin, the box, the sarcophagus, is sealed shut and carted down to the river and lobbed in. Now, there are slightly variant versions in some of the older pyramid texts as to quite how Azur dies, so they don't all agree on the manner of death. And even in the Plutarch story, it's not abundantly clear if Azur suffocates inside the box through lack of oxygen, or if, when the sarcophagus is lobbed in the Nile, if he drowns. But certainly it became a widely held belief in Egypt for an extremely long time that the act of drowning in the Nile lifted the dead person from the realms of any old ancestor up to an elevated status of being amongst the celestials themselves. And we can see that when Antinous, the boyfriend of the Emperor Hadrian, went over the side of a boat on the Nile into the waters and drowned. Now, there's a heated debate as to whether he committed suicide, he jumped, or did he just get drunk and fall off a boat, or did somebody deliberately push him over, and was it murder? Well, bit of an Agatha Christie there, nobody knows for certain, but whatever happened to Antinous, basically he drowned. And in the coming months after his death, various Egyptians reported having visions of Antinous as the sacred one who drowned in the Nile, much like Azur. And word got back to Hadrian, and he was so convinced that his boyfriend was now, ex-boyfriend, deceased boyfriend, was now a god, that he had the entire city of Antinopolis built in Egypt, which nowadays there's only ruins left of it, that whole city named after the lad. And there were temples to Antinous all over the Roman Empire, including some kind of a shrine in Capital St Mary, where a tiny little figurine of Antinous has been discovered by archaeologists. So drowning in the Nile becomes this big thing. The body floats off downriver, and for a good period of time, Seth rules in his brother's place, and Azet has to flee for her own safety. But she doesn't just go into hiding, she actively tries to find the body of her deceased husband. She searches high, she searches low, and eventually she follows the trail, and it's all a bit of a detective story. She follows the trail to the land of Byblos. And in the land of Byblos, the chest has washed up onto the banks, where this huge sacred tree is growing. It's got these very knotty roots, and the roots wrap round the sarcophagus and kind of absorb the sarcophagus inside the trunk of the tree. And the tree is held sacred by the people of Byblos, and the king and queen of Byblos, being typical aristocracy, typical royalty, decide, well, if it's sacred, they're going to have it. And so the tree gets chopped down and carted off to the palace, where it's held as a reverential object. And Azet turns up, and again, according to Plutarch, she wants to get access to the wooden pillar, this chopped down tree, so that she can retrieve her husband's body. But, as is often the case in so many mythologies, if the gods turn up in their full blinding glory, it has this habit of incinerating anyone who looks on them, who is a mere mortal. So the gods have to disguise themselves as other things. And so Azet disguises herself as an old lady and turns up offering to act as a nurse to the queen's infant son. And the queen, for reasons best known to herself, accepts the offer of this random old lady who's just appeared out of nowhere and invites her in, and for a while, a few weeks, she's looking after the kid. Until one day, rumour from the other servants gets back to the queen that this old lady is very odd and is doing some very strange things that the servants are worried about. So the queen peeps through a crack in the door when the old lady is looking after the infant to find out what she's getting up to. And she sees the old lady sitting in front of the fireplace, crooning and singing these weird songs, and holding the baby over the fireplace. And of course the queen goes berserk, and she thinks her son's about to be burnt to death. And she bursts into the room screaming and hollering and tries to drag the baby off the old woman. Whereupon the old woman stands up, whips off her disguise, and it's Azet, the goddess herself, and obviously the queen, rather gets weak-kneed and realises she's made a mistake. And the goddess says, had the queen but waited a bit longer, the spell would have been finished, and the baby would have been immortal and gone on to become the greatest leader the world had ever known. But the Queen, Dozy Mary, has disrupted the spell, and tough luck, it can't be redone. And the Queen is very apologetic, and obviously you don't want to go and annoy a goddess, that never goes down well, does it? So asks the goddess what is she doing here, and Azet says she's come for the wooden pillar, and so the wooden pillar is made available, and she removes the coffin from within and leaves the rest of the pillar there so it can go on being a sacred object to the people of Byblos. Carts the coffin off somewhere safe down by the river and opens it up, and there is her husband. Now, according to Plutarch, at this juncture, Setek and his followers leap out from the bushes where they've been following her and seeing what she's getting up to, and just as Azet is about to work an act of magic, they chop up the body of of Azur, and cast the bits hither and yon. And Azet has to go. She escapes, and she has to go on another quest to find her husband. But this time, rather like reassembling a jigsaw, she's trying to find the various bits and pieces. Now, according to one version of this story, he's chopped into 14 bits. There are other versions which suggest different numbers, but we'll stick to 14 for the moment. And gradually she finds an arm here, a foot there, a head somewhere else. And at each of the locations she finds a bit of Azur. That becomes a huge temple site as a sacred place. And you can find similar versions of stories like that in India and various other places where body parts of a deity, a god or a goddess, are found in various geographic locations. And once they're found there, those places become shrines to the deity. So the interment of the body in the holy place becomes part and parcel of the sense of reverence, of magic and mystery. Similar stories in Scandinavian cultures, in Ireland, where the burial of a body makes the place special. Irish stories often have a lake bursting out over the site of the corpse, over a grave, and it becomes a sacred lake with the body of the wise Whatsit, the warrior, the druid, whoever it may be, buried at the bottom of the lake. So slim story. Anyway, to continue back with the plot, she's accompanied by 7 golden scorpions and Nehebhet, her sister-in-law, and eventually they find the various bits of the body, reassemble them, wrap them up in bandages, creating the first mummified corpse, the first sa, which is the Egyptian word for mummified corpse. One bit is missing. Now, according to Plutarch, the missing bit is the bit that most men would not want to be missing at all, these nether regions, and it's been eaten by the Oxyrhynchus fish, which is a type of carp that lives in the Nile. And Azet has to provide a replacement part, which in one version is made of gold and in another version is made of ivory, and that's attached to the spot. And Azet begins to work an act of magic and resurrects her husband, and they make mad, passionate love. But the spell only lasts a certain period of time, so he's only alive for a short period of time, long enough to do the deed at least, and then he dies, and I dare say the bandages unravel a bit from all that passionate love-making. And she is pregnant with Heru, whom the Greeks refer to as Horus. There's actually a few deities with the title Heru, which gets a bit confusing as to which one is being spoken about in any given myth. But Heru, the falcon-headed deity. Once her husband has gone back into death, because I say it spell only lasts so long, he then becomes the king of the dead, the king of Duat, the land beneath the earth, or the land off to the west, I should say, the land of the Westerners, where the spirits of the dead go. And he becomes green-skinned. You can see in that picture there, he's green-skinned. The association there is with the breadbasket of Egypt, all the crops, the grain, the dying and rising god, that just as the grain grows up and the harvester comes along with a scythe and cuts it down and it's dead, but of course the following spring it grows again. So Azur is the corn, the breadbasket of Egypt, the feeder of his people, and by implication, of course, his brother Setech is the scythe, the thing that cuts him down. And so even though interpretations of Setech as time went on saw him seen as a more and more villainous, nasty character, he actually plays a very positive, vital role in Egyptian philosophy, theology, mythology. And indeed, in story, he stands at the front of the Bach of Ra, the chief of the deity, and when the Bach is sailing through the skies and night is approaching, it goes down into the western gate opens, and the boat goes into Duat, into the underworld, and it is Wetwawet, the wolf-headed deity who's referred to as the opener of the ways. He opens the gate at the front of the boat, but stood next to him is Setech. And when that boat goes into the underworld, it's besieged by various scary monsters from the underworld, including the great serpent Apepi, who every single night tries to destroy the boat, and it is Setech, this supposedly villainous character, who actually fights off the forces of chaos, the forces of mayhem, and maintains cosmic order, because he is the one fierce enough, ruthless enough, daring and dangerous enough to do this deadly thing. Going back to what we were saying about the iron fist and the velvet glove, it needs that iron fist to fight off the forces of mayhem, the forces of destruction, the forces of wickedness and selfishness. You can't be too gentle when it comes to that kind of thing. You've got to have fierceness in your heart, and Setech is that fierceness. So though he gets a bad press, he's actually a very positive deity in many, many respects. And this story became the bedrock of, we are told, of a lot of Egyptian culture and ceremony and festivals throughout the year. Whilst a lot of modern-day pagans, being very heavily influenced by Wicca and some by Druidry, are familiar with the idea of 8 Sabbats, 8 festivals in the year, the ancient Egyptian calendar had a crazy number of festivals, 80-odd plus festivals over the course of the year. Now, the average Egyptian did not celebrate all of those, otherwise they'd have died of liver cirrhosis long since. They celebrated some of those festivals, whichever were pertinent to the locality in which they lived, kind of the local one for that particular sepat, and their particular festivals, their particular deities that were considered very important there. There were some festivities that were celebrated nationwide, but the majority were local festivities. And certainly the portions of the story of Azur and Azet and Setech and their carryings on, elements of that story were celebrated at different points on the calendar of Egyptian festivities, and in a similar way that we are very familiar obviously with Christianity and the story of Christ, and elements of it celebrated at Easter, elements at Christmas, other elements at other points of the year like Epiphany and so on. That story shapes the Christian year, so this story was one of the big ones that helped shape the nationwide Egyptian year. Other deities had their own stories, but which had festivals associated with elements of them, but they often tended to be more local rather than national, by and large, with some exceptions to that. So this became a significant structure to Egyptian festivities. Once Azur has died, he becomes, or after him rather I should say, all those pharaohs who died became associated with Azur. They were the dead pharaoh, they became sort of part and parcel of Azur, whilst the still living pharaoh was chiefly identified with Azur's son, who eventually, after another long story, referred to as the contendings of Haru and Setech, the contendings between the nephew and the uncle. Eventually Haru, to shorten a very racy story with lots of rather sordid and gory activities taking place in that story, which maybe is one to tell on a different occasion, the resolution of that story is that the two gods, Setek and Haru, come before the council of the gods, who've got thoroughly fed up with this punch-up that's been going on between nephew and uncle for decade upon decade upon decade. And they decide that Egypt itself is just being ruined by all the constant warfare, and some resolution must be found. So Haru puts his case, and Setek puts his case, and they have a bit of a crown court kind of a session where they both argue the toss, and the gods must be the judge of the case, and the two have to abide by whatever decision the gods make. And eventually the decision is that Haru has the greater claim, after some really sordid shenanigans to try and discredit him. But Haru has the greater claim and will rule in his late father's stead and become the new pharaoh, the new living leader, which is why the pharaohs of Egypt, whilst they were alive, were associated with Haru. But, and this is an important point to bear in mind as we draw towards a close, Haru makes peace with his uncle, despite all of the grotty things that the uncle has tried to do to him, tried to kill him on many occasions, tried to gouge out an eye, tried to rape him, tried to do all sorts of quite grotty things. At the end of the day, the gods having made their decision, Haru realises that there must be peace, that they can't sustain a future in which Setek is disgruntled, is cast out, is exiled, is a force out of control. He must be kind of reined into the cosmic order. And so he offers to his uncle to become a bit like a sort of a viceroy or a vizier, to govern over the Red Lands, so that whilst technically Haru governs the lot, half of Egypt, Upper Egypt, where the desert is, will be the land that Setek has representational government of. So he goes off to become the king of the deserts, the god of the deserts, and is very much associated with not only the heat of the ferocious heat of the desert during the day, but the coldness of the desert in night, when the temperature massively plummets, and is associated with the wild and dangerous creatures of the desert, with wild storms and thunder and lightning, and with drunkenness as well. He's not the only deity associated with drunkenness, but he is credited with the development of beer and intoxication, and sort of, just as I suppose you could imagine the skies when there's a storm on may look a bit like they're drunk and roaring and raging and having an Oliver Reed moment. So beer, if you guzzle enough of it, will induce in a lot of people. Some of us just fall asleep, but in some people they obviously get real airy and loud and roar and rage and get horny or whatever. So beer, as this force that liberates whatever, is kept under wraps by sedate, civilized, polite behaviour, and very much green-skinned Azur is the deity of civilized life, of polite life, of kind of nice, genteel, well-mannered existence. So his brother, now he is no longer aspiring to lead the royal court, is off leading the forces of wildness in the desert, becomes a god of darkness and heat and cold and extremities, a god of the wild, the mad, the dangerous. He was also a god much associated with foreigners, because for quite a long period of time Egypt came under the dominance of a group of people referred to as the Hyksos. Hyksos is a Greek word, a translation of the original Egyptian words, and rather ironically the original Egyptian words basically is a bit like saying them the foreigners. It's not a polite tale. So when the Egyptians are writing about the period of dominance by the people that the Greeks called the Hyksos, the Egyptians are basically saying when we were dominated by them foreign lot. And it's a bit of a rude sort of a way to describe it. But for a good few centuries they were under the rulership of this other bunch of people. They very much favoured, not only did they bring their own gods and goddesses with them, but of the Egyptian pantheon they very much favoured Seth as a deity of their choice. And after they'd been booted out of Egypt and driven back to wherever they came from, no one is entirely sure quite where they came from, although various historians make different arguments as to quite which bit of the world the Hyksos actually originated in. But when they were given the boot out of Egypt, after that point Seth kind of falls from favour and gets, because he's been associated with this occupying army, this sort of enemy force, he becomes also generally associated with foreigners and strangers, not perhaps wholly dissimilar to the way in which Zeus in the Greek pantheon is referred to as Zeus Thania, the god of strangers, the god of foreigners. And that can be understood as both a patron of travellers, to whom people must be polite, because of course, like so many civilizations, there's a tremendous emphasis on treating the visiting stranger well, but also a god of that strange weird lot from up the road. The Egyptians, like most imperial people, regarded themselves as highly civilized and rather looked down their noses at just about everybody else as being a bunch of half-witted knuckle-draggers. So Seth becomes associated with the god who looks after the interests of all those weird foreign types from other places that the Egyptians didn't quite know what to do with, and were very resentful of the period of time when they were occupied by the Hyksos. And then later, of course, they ended up being occupied by Greek presence, and then by the Roman presence, and then eventually, of course, Islam sweeps in and knocks ancient Egyptian culture for six. Christianity had a damn good go at doing that first, but Islam finished off what Christianity started, and only tiny scraps of the religion survived in a very underground manner, with the odd sort of devotee here and there, at least until the revival with the Rosetta Stone and the burgeoning re-interest in things Egyptian. Although many people in Egypt, especially ordinary everyday working class people, even though they are Islamic, many of them have had a kind of a parallel interest in the old temples and pyramids and sites, and you get people utilising pregnant women turning to Tuareg and so on for help, as well as going to the mosque one day and going quietly off into the desert to leave an offering for Tuareg, the goddess of hippos, the goddess of pregnancy, the next day. So there's a bit of a kind of a double life. For not all Egyptians, clearly, but for a fair number, has persisted over time. But I've already gone a bit past the time that I said I was going to try and do this in the same time slot as I did for Leaping Hare. So having gone a bit over, I'll draw it to a close out and just leave this as an example of a hugely influential story. Just to reiterate, we don't quite know how much of that Plutarch version of the story is identical to the original Egyptian version, and how much of it Plutarch might have added on himself, or, if not by himself, at least picked up from somebody somewhere and just assumed it was Egyptian, not realising that perhaps bits of it had been embroidered by people from outside of Egypt. We just have to kind of go with it to a large extent, and let the gods, the Nedjaru themselves, guide us as to which bits make most resonance with ancient Egyptian understanding and which bits are better understood as later cultural additions. If anyone has any questions, do feel free to email me, the usual address, but you can also buy my book on Egyptian mythology if you like. A bit of an advert, bit of a plug there. It's called Pantheon the Egyptians, and it's by Moon Books Publishers. I'll put a link in with the YouTube link for this. Thank you.